We've seen in the last presentation the classical relationship between the sciences and learnt a little bit about what a science is. And we started to look at the philosophical sciences. We got as far as going through the science of epistemology, the study of certain knowledge regarding our knowledge, our ability to know things, to learn things. We're now going to look at the next challenging area of philosophy, the science of metaphysics. Metaphysics popularly is considered to be a very mysterious science, and that's partly because of the proper object of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of what is fit to be. It's the study of existence itself. It's the study of existence as existence, qua existence, to use Latin. It's considered to be the first science. You have to do metaphysics before you can do other sciences. Aristotle wrote his book, the Metaphysics, before he wrote his book, the Physics. And the reason is that you have to understand metaphysics in order to have the foundation thinking suitable to do physics. Because metaphysics can be employed to consider existence of things which are not physical and not concrete, metaphysics sometimes is employed in the understanding of things which are outside of physical nature, things that are unnatural. For instance, does Santa Claus exist? Well, most people would say, of course he doesn't. You know, when you're 3 years old or 5 years old or what have you, we tell kids that, but you know, it's just a polite story that's been made up over the years, and it makes for a fun Christmas. And so yes, you're not likely to have the air traffic disturbed by a very old man and a flying sled being pulled by reindeers getting in the way of the jumbo jets going from Sydney to London. But in a sense, Santa Claus has a type of existence because it's meaningful to talk about Santa Claus. His existence certainly isn't concrete, it's not material, but he exists as a very robust idea, a very definite idea. Okay. It may not be physical, but it has its usefulness and so on. A square circle, something that you can never draw, but the fact that we can talk about it means that it has a form of existence, not a very robust form of existence. It's almost a contradiction. It is a contradiction. And then, of course, you've got things like rocks and computer monitors and people and all the rest of it. And so we're doing a little bit of metaphysics there, because what we're really doing is just exploring the nature of existence, what things are, how existence can work. And that's what metaphysics is about. It's important because every other science deals with existing things. We don't have a science of absurdity. I think Jung tried to develop a science of dreams, which is probably about as close as we could get to a science of absurdity. But in the practical order, we study things that exist. When we're an astronomer, we study the heavenly bodies because they exist. When we're a geologist, we study rocks because they exist and so on. And we study the way that they exist. Study of metaphysics not only deals with the question of how or if things can exist, but they also goes into the question of how things come to exist. And that has to do with the question of cause. Cause is very important, one of the important aspects of metaphysics. And I'll just introduce a couple of the themes, if you like, in metaphysics. I won't go through the whole thing. That would be an entire unit itself, maybe even a couple of units. We'll just go through some of the highlights, if you like, of metaphysics. Causality is very important in metaphysics because metaphysics says, well, if I've got a volcano or a cream bun or a new computer, or a star. One of the things which I can ask about any of those things is where'd they come from? What made them? What caused them? And in Aristotelian metaphysics, realist metaphysics, it's been concluded that there are 4 basic causes, which in some cases can be broken up into other things. And the 4 causes, and these are worth remembering because these terms tend to be used from time to time in other contexts, and certainly we're going to be bumping into them from time to time in ethics. The 4 causes are very, very important. The 4 causes are the material cause of the thing. Let's look at the computer. Okay, material cause is the raw materials that goes into making the computer. That might be wire and silicon and plastic and who knows else, maybe a bit of glass or something. And that's the raw materials that go into making the computer. However, a computer is not simply a pile of silicon, copper, plastic, so on. A computer consists of those bits of raw materials, but shaped into a very precise design, a blueprint. So it has a particular form. When I look at a house, I'm not looking at a pile of bricks. I'm looking at a pile of bricks and maybe glass and tiles and wood and whatever else goes into the house that have been organised into a particular design. So the formal cause is the design, the blueprint of the thing. To a certain extent, turning a pile of bricks into a house is where you put design or form into raw materials. And so when we're driving along the street, you would say to your kids, oh, can we look out? There should be a house along here somewhere. You don't sort of say, oh, look out, there'll be a pile of bricks along here somewhere. Because we operate at the formal level pretty much automatically. And we've already been using this expression form in our previous discussion so far. So form is very, very important. And it is one of the causes of things. The third cause is what in philosophy is referred to as the efficient cause, or the maker, the outside agent, which causes the form to be put into the matter, or the matter to be organised according to the design, or the form. In making the computer, the maker will be the people working in the factories that press the buttons on the machines and so on. Curiously, the efficient cause is often a compound of a lot of different things operating in a kind of hierarchy. And so we could say the machine made the computers, but really you had people making the machine and operating the machine and so on. And so the people, the engineers and technicians and what have you that operate the machines, they would be seen as the ultimate efficient cause, the ultimate maker, but they use instruments or tools. And so the efficient cause is broken up between the ultimate cause, ultimate efficient cause, the person, and the instrumental causes, which are the tools and the machines and so on. And so if you get the plumber to come out and fix your pipes or what have you, the plumber will come out, he'll be the efficient cause, but he's the ultimate efficient cause, and he's using his tools. They might use a hammer and a screwdriver and whatever he's else going to use. They're his instruments, so they become the instrumental efficient causes. Those three causes largely are responsible for what's making something. If you have somebody making a computer and so on, all you need is raw materials, a good design, and somebody who's smart enough to be able to put them all together, and you've got the computer popping out. However, with those three, you would never get any computers. And the reason is that people get bored of making computers if there wasn't somebody who wanted a computer. In a sense, you contribute to the manufacture or the production of the computer, because a computer wouldn't exist if there wasn't someone like you wanting to use it. This object, the need, the purpose of the thing being made is actually the motivating cause. It's not actually in the thing, and it's not actually involved in the thing directly, but all of the other causes are organised, militated towards the making the object as a result of the demand for the object. You want a computer, And so people knowing that you want the computer will cause people to design computers, people to dig the copper out of the ground and do all the other things that need to be done to get the raw materials. You're actually causing the employees and so on, and maybe the designers to work and so on. So the final cause is important. Its purpose. There's an entire science devoted to final causes called teleology. It's the science of understanding things or situations on the basis of their final ends, their causes, the needs that they fulfill, the purpose that they fulfill, and so on. So cause is a very useful interpretive mechanism for understanding the way that things exist. And as you've noticed, we've already been talking about forms of things already, and we're going to be talking about forms when we look at ethics in particular. And so remember the causes, the 4 causes, and how they work, because you'll find them very useful for a lot of intellectual activities. Okay, so we talked about cause. Another common theme in metaphysics is the fact that metaphysics ultimately is about statements of existence. And the statements of existence are usually not about statements of particular existence, but rather statements of the way that forms exist, and forms exist in the concrete. And so these statements are as simple as the statement, water is wet. Water is wet, technically, philosophically speaking, is a philosophical statement. And in fact, just about any time we use the verb to be, we are making a philosophical statement. That car is fast. That dog is dead. That person is ethical. We're actually making metaphysical statements about those various things which the sentences are concerned with. We have metaphysical statements all through science. You can see that in the physical sciences. Water, for a chemist, is a compound of hydrogen and oxygen. So that's a statement about what water is, the nature of its existence. If you see something which is not a compound of hydrogen and oxygen, it might look like water, it might in many ways appear to be water, but it won't be, because you can't have water which is not composed of hydrogen and oxygen. Other aspects of water, other attributes of water necessary for life. It's a solvent, it's colourless, tends to be a liquid at standard temperature and pressure, to use the scientific sort of expression of normality. Okay, so if you're at sea level at a temperature of about 20 degrees Celsius, you won't find many blocks of ice getting around the place, because water isn't like that. It's not solid at our normal conditions, and so on. And so the usefulness of these statements is that we have metaphysical statements as really the building blocks, the steps that science kind of uses to proceed. We're now going to look at Plato's metaphysical hierarchy. This is a particular aspect, if you like, of metaphysics, which is useful to be aware of. Plato was a philosopher before Aristotle, and he was one of Socrates' students, and so he took a lot of the ideas that Socrates spoke about but didn't actually write up in books, and developed them a little bit further. And he contributed an important fundamental observation in the area of metaphysics, and it has to do with the relationship between particulars or appearance and reality. I mention this because this is an important distinction when we come to ethics. Aristotle reasoned this way. He said, we experience particulars in the concrete. So we see that man with the funny hat, or this computer monitor, or that dog. And Plato would say, well, when you look at that, we see a particular man, somehow we get a bit of an idea from that particular man of what it is to be a man, or if that particular dog gives us an idea of what dogs are like. If we see a whole lot of dogs, we might get an idea of what dogness in general is all about. And so, little by little, by looking at a number of particular instances of things, dogs, computer monitors, people and so on, we get an idea of what the forms of those things is. And so even though we encounter only the appearance of particulars, what we're more interested in are the forms that we abstract to. Now, I've already looked at abstraction when we looked at epistemology. The thing about the forms for Aristotle was that the forms are available to the intellect. What that means is that we see a man, we see a house. We don't simply see a pattern of colours or a pile of bricks or, you know, a lump of chemical processes going on, and we then have to think of it. Oh, that pile of chemistry over there, that's a man. Or that pile of baked clay lumps is a house. We just simply see the forms. And so the forms are available to the intellect, and they require a higher human operation, especially when we abstract not simply to the particular men, but to the idea of man in itself. And humans are particularly capable of reflecting in depth on the natures of things and their relationships. So these require higher human operations. For Aristotle, the particulars are always imperfect. So if I see a particular dog, it might be an old dog or a young dog, it might be a silly dog, it might be a dog with fleas. It will seldom be the perfect dog. Dogness is something that at least is an idea. We see this particularly with human things. For instance, we can consider, let's say, computers. The very first computers, we call them computers, and they were part of the class of things that we would call computers. They had the form of being a computer, but they were slow, they had very limited memory, they had limitations in terms of the communication with the people who were using them and all sorts of things. They were very fragile, you had to put them in air-conditioned buildings and whatnot. So they were imperfect in many, many different ways. However, once we had the idea of what it was to be a computer, we could talk about computers and we'd say, well, a better computer would run faster and it could run in a more adverse environment and it would have more copious memory and it would have better connections to the people that are using it and the environment in which it works. And so we could think of the practical computers we could see, but we can also imagine in our intellect the perfect computer, or at least computers of greater perfection. And so the fact that we can do that, the fact that we can understand something which is better than anything that currently exists, means that the concept of the forms that we have are potentially perfect. And so when I say computer or dog or chair, I'm really thinking of the form of the chair, of which the particular chair or the particular dog is only an imperfect example. And this ability of humans to conceptualize things which haven't existed before is largely responsible for our ability to manipulate things and our ability to create new things. The first jumbo jet, Boeing 747, it existed first as a series of drawings and calculations living in computers in the minds of a tribe of engineers. It didn't exist in reality. And so the engineers that designed the Boeing 747 didn't actually have to make one and work out whether it would fly or not. They had done that simply by thinking about the forms that they were manipulating in their minds and on their computers and so on. And this first existence of things, especially human inventions, is quite insightful because it can show us that the forms exist ahead of the concrete realities. And we can even do this with things that appear to be natural. For instance, we could say we've seen ice. We know what ice is. It's a natural solid water, cold water. Now, did the idea of ice exist before there were humans to give it a name? Well, of course it did. You know, there was solid, cold water, you know, in the days before humans walked the earth. There was the notion of ice, the form of ice, even before the universe cooled down to the point where H2O could exist as a solid, or maybe before it even existed at all. And while we can't see this to a certain extent, we can, you know, conceptualize it. The fact that if we were to get ourselves a time machine, and let's imagine we could make a time machine, and we were to hop into our time machine, and we were to wind back the clock to the last ice age, press the button. Now, time machine takes us back to, you know, 30,000 years ago, whenever it was, and we hopped out. We could meaningfully say, oh, there is ice. We're talking about the form of ice which is in our minds being, you know, expressed or realized in the ice that's all around us. If we were to hop back in our time machine and wind back our clock maybe 10 billion years or some extraordinary large amount back to the point where the Big Bang had hardly happened, we could then potentially look out of our time machine at a point where there was no ice. In fact, there was no H2O in existence because the Big Bang had all of the matter in the universe all, you know, in this little pea-sized lump of incredibly dense material. And we could look out of our time machine and say, oh, there's no ice here. Now, what we're really recognizing is that there was the potential for ice to exist, you know, 500 billion years ago, but in the concrete reality, it didn't exist. So the concept of it existed, the form of it existed. So the point here is to get you to think about the way that forms exist before the appearance, the practical examples and so on. The forms are perfect. Well, they can be perfect. I can imagine the perfect motorcycle or the perfect computer, even though I may not be able to build it. But I will find that if I have an understanding of what perfection is in the area of computers or motorcycles or jam on toast, whatever it is that I want to make, I have an idea, I will be able to work towards that progressively as an intellectual activity primarily, and then it will be expressed in terms of what Plato would call the realm of appearances, the realm of, if you like, concrete things. Now, this relationship, why am I dwelling on this? It's because this relationship between reality, or the forms, and appearances is a very, very important one. What is more important? The appearance of something, you know, the particular motorbike, the particular computer, or is the idea of a computer more important? If I was stuck with the particulars, the appearances, I would probably never be able to develop everything. If the only thing I could think of is the type of computer I've got in front of me right now, how could I build a better one? How could I understand what better meant? Because I wouldn't be able to conceptualize the more perfect. But it's by having this idea of better, and if I've got better and a whole series of things which is one better than the other, ultimately there must exist a concept, a understanding of perfect. I may not know what it is, of course, but I can work towards it. So, we experience particulars in the concrete, and they are what Plato would call appearances. Okay? A slightly more technical use of the word appearance. We abstract into the forms, and the forms have these characteristics. They're available in the intellect, and they're perfect, and so on. The forms are what exist in our minds. They are the blueprints, the formal cause of potential things. And usually they're embodied in the things that we encounter in the concrete, in other words, the real world stuff, but they're usually embodied only imperfectly. And so if I do cook my jam on toast, it will probably be not quite the perfect jam on toast. I might say that it's a perfect jam on toast, but there's always a possibility of somebody making a jam on toast which is just a little tiny bit nicer. I can conceptualize the perfect jam on toast, but all of the real ones are likely to be suboptimal, not quite perfect. That gives us the opportunity to think about the forms. The intellectual activity is how to make my next piece of jam on toast a little bit better. And so I'm thinking of the forms and thinking about the relationships between them and how I can use those relationships to make something better in future. Okay, well, that takes us into metaphysics. I wanted to go over metaphysics with a certain amount of detail, just to introduce you to it, because it is an obscure area of the philosophical sciences. However, the more you understand metaphysics, the richer and deeper it becomes as a science, and the more useful it becomes for things as diverse as chemistry or ethics. Let's now move to another branch of the philosophical sciences. We're going to be looking at philosophical anthropology, which is a delightful, long, technical-sounding name, philosophical anthropology. It's also known as philosophical psychology. And philosophical psychology is the study of what can be known about the human person. What are humans like? Modern anthropology is a particular branch, if you like, of philosophical anthropology. Modern anthropology simply goes out and looks at examples of humans, human societies, individual humans, and so on, studies them and makes conclusions and observations about it. Philosophical anthropology can take off where modern anthropology ends to a certain extent, because philosophical anthropology can abstract what we've seen in particular appearances of humans, to use the terminology that we have just been looking at from Plato. And we say philosophical anthropology explores the question of what it is to be human, not simply what particular humans, individual societies look like, but what it is fundamentally, essentially, to be human. And we make a number of statements, observations about what it is to be human. That leads us into a diverse set of understandings, and they're all very important. It gives us an insight into the way that psychology works and so on. It can also give us an understanding of our ethical relationships, because if we understand what humans are, that helps us to understand our relationships to other humans, and that is essentially the matter of ethics. We can say the material cause of ethical principles or moral principles is the understanding of what it is to be human and people's relationships. Let's look at some aspects of what it is to be human. We know from biology that humans are referred to as Homo sapiens. Homo sapien is a way of saying they are thinking men who think, Homo sapiens. They are living animals with bodies and rational minds. There are some questions as to whether or not other creatures, other animals, think in the same way that humans do. It's a little bit difficult to answer that question, because so far not very many people have been able to have deep and meaningful conversations with their dogs, and certainly less deep and meaningful conversations with the fleas on the dogs or the cockroaches that are in the cupboard. There appears to be limitations on the way that lesser animals think. And what distinguishes humans is that we have meaningful conceptual language and the ability to communicate and develop concepts in a very developed way. an order of magnitude, order of ability well above dogs, cats, and cockroaches. We have a hierarchy of faculties. Humans have bodies, and bodies have needs, so we need to be fed and clothed and sheltered and so on. And so we have these different needs because of our humanity. We have physical strength, we have faculties of the senses, so when we feed ourselves we like to be fed with food that looks nice and tastes nice and smells nice. And to a certain extent our need to be fed is better served by food that looks nice, smells nice, tastes nice, maybe has a pleasant texture as well. We don't want to be eating mush, even if it tastes nice, necessarily, certainly all the time. And this gives us insights as to how we can find happiness, because when our various faculties are presented with good things, so when our faculty of taste is presented with something which has a pleasing taste, a good taste, it makes us happy. So I'd far prefer to be eating something which tastes nice as opposed to something which is tasting pretty sour and ugly. And I just know I have to because it might be some medicine or something. Likewise, it's more pleasant to be eating something that smells nice and looks nice and so on. So as each one of my faculties is presented with goods that faculty is able to apprehend, able to take on board, it contributes to my happiness. And so I could think of virtually any physical aspect of my body, my clothes, my shelter, and so on, as contributing to my happiness when those senses are presented with the most pleasing thing to those senses. Out of our faculties, we also have the intellectual faculties, and that's what distinguishes us from dogs and cats and cockroaches. If happiness is realized through our faculties being presented with good things, the mind, when it is presented with good things, is also going to help us be happy. One way or another, we probably want to have our intellectual pursuits. We want to pursue those when we've got our bodies adequately cared for, so we don't really want to be watching a good movie or what have you when we're starving hungry or we're sort of cold or what have you, or we're sitting on gravel or something. So our sensations are poor. But once we've got ourselves to the point where we're housed in a comfortable situation, where we've got our food needs satisfied moderately and our shelter and so on, then we find that our interests tend to move from the physical things, the things that suit our bodies, to the things which suit our minds. And so we would say that the mind is the highest faculty of the human, and so in a sense it is the source of our highest pleasure. Now this is a philosophical conclusion that a lot of people might argue with, and that will really be a story for another day to go in great detail. But we have a hierarchy of faculties. We can certainly conclude that. Let's look at the mind. The senses present information to the mind from the outside, and they tell the mind about what's happening on the outside. That's the senses. We have the memory, which is a separate faculty within the mind. The memory is basically a store of past sensations and past thoughts. And so I might remember the smell of some pleasant thing or maybe some ugly thing. I might remember the taste or the sight and so on. I also remember ideas that have come into my mind. Last night I thought of writing a poem. This morning I actually remembered it and I wrote it down. My memory was able to move that thought from the past to the present, and so the memory is a store of ideas as well. And the memory, those ideas can include the forms and the relationships and so on. The memory provides data, if you like, to the next faculty of the mind, which is the intellect. The intellect orders the memories, the ideas, the sensations, and makes conclusions. It produces new ideas from those which are presented to it. And so the intellect is our rational part, our perhaps creative part, at least intellectually creative. And it's the part which takes us from simply being a brain that is able to store information and perhaps do simple correlations to something which can genuinely work from old ideas, existing ideas, to new ideas. It's where our creativity is, it's where our problem solving is, and it enables us to be able to move from existing understanding to future understanding and do things like abstraction and all the rest of it. The intellect processes the information, the data which is available to it, mainly through the memory, and it's an intermediary because after we've thought out which way to act or how to build a better mousetrap or whatever it is that we're putting before our intellect, the actual final decision, especially decisions for action, moves to another faculty of the mind, which is the will. The will is not the intellect because it doesn't process ideas, it doesn't draw conclusions. It does something fairly similar in some ways. The will makes decisions mainly for action. And the will is said to be that faculty of the mind that chooses the good as understood. And this underlines one of the problems with the human mind, and it's a problem that we're all aware of, mainly in others, and that is that people make mistakes. I might be vain enough to think that I never make mistakes, but I can certainly see mistakes in the actions of other people. And that's because the will of those people, maybe occasionally me when I make a mistake, is because I am presented with competing good things, whether to be on time or well groomed for my next appointment that I'm running a little bit late for. I make a decision, and I might make the wrong decision. The will sometimes either has goods and alternatives presented to it that are not well thought out, and so the data is faulty, or the will itself doesn't choose the genuine, better outcome. And we find that each part of this system that we've outlined in the mind has the problem that each part is almost accurate, almost perfect, almost true to what we aim for. The intellect is not always logical in its deductions. And again, we can usually see that more succinctly in the mental determinations of others than in ourselves. But one way or another, we all tend to draw illogical conclusions from time to time. And there's a complete and delightful science of logic, especially informal logic. Informal logic sounds like it's easy logic because it's informal, it's sort of logic with, board shorts on or something. In fact, informal logic simply means that type of logic which applies in normal, shall we say, conversation. And so the intellect makes mistakes, the will makes mistakes. We all know that memory makes mistakes. We are all guilty from time to time of forgetting things, forgetting a name or a face or where we should be for a particular appointment. So the memory makes mistakes, and of course we'll be looking at the way that the senses make mistakes as well. So all of the faculties of the mind have their limitations. As G.K. Chesterton once wrote rather insightfully, the human mind is almost rational. And if you think it's completely rational, you'll make some fairly major mistakes. If you think it's not rational at all, well, you really don't pay respect to the fairly impressive achievements of the human mind. Now, this leads us to the last faculty of the mind, which is the passions or the emotions. The passions are that part of our mind which prompts action and creates feelings, inclinations, if you like, that are not based on reason. They might be based on a certain amount of sensation, but the passions tend to take those sensations, maybe mixed with some memories, and draw conclusions which are sometimes very intense, but they don't respond to logic. The passions are an important part of our mind. It's certainly something that we have to accept as a real part of our mental makeup. They tend to be the focus of much of positive psychology, the modern psychology, if you like, because we're always aiming for emotional stability or following our feelings and not feeling guilty about the silly things we do and that sort of stuff, which always comes down to putting our emotions first. In the movie series Star Wars, the Force can be largely interpreted as the call, the admonition to follow our feelings. Follow the Force, Luke, is in practice what you do when you stop thinking and you simply make decisions by some obscure instinct or emotion. Humans do not live by instincts to the extent that animals do, but we do have some instincts. Fear, for instance, is partially intellectual. It's partially an emotional, immediate response to sensations. And sometimes we need to manage things like fear. And we manage that by subjecting the emotions to the intellect and sort of to the rational will. Largely, if you look at a very young person, maybe a baby a few months old, you'll find that they operate pretty much entirely by their emotions. If they sense hunger, they respond with sadness, and everyone can hear them crying and making quite a fuss. They want to be fed. And that's a very good and healthy thing. Otherwise, we'd probably leave our babies and there wouldn't be very many people on the planet. But as people grow up, they must learn to manage their emotions. And we're all familiar with examples of adults who are still acting more like babies because they follow their emotions excessively. On the other hand, you can have people whose emotional awareness is so low that they are more like a computing machine walking around on two legs because their emotions are in some way depressed. We have psychological names for all of these circumstances, and usually the reality is probably a little bit more moderate than the conclusions of the onlookers. Okay, that takes us through the 5 major faculties of the mind, and these become a very useful way of understanding the human mind, human mental processes, and we can learn a lot from them. In a separate presentation, we'll look a little bit further as to what implications they can be. But for this, for our purposes here, we really want to be able to sort of recognise that the mind has these different faculties. We're talking about 5 of them, and they are useful. They have different activities. They help us to understand our world. Certainly, the intellect does. Enables us to understand conceptually and abstractly, so we can understand the forms and the causes. But because of the limitations of our mental computing power, we make mistakes. When we apply this framework to the ethical issue, making mistakes will be largely understood in terms of making unethical decisions or deciding to do unethical things. There are other types of mistakes that we can make. We can simply forget somebody's name or call somebody the wrong name. We can make a calculation error when we go to add up the shopping list or something. So there are many ways that we can make mistakes. The most important of them, really, for our social lives is those ethical mistakes where we decide to rob a bank because we think that's a really good idea, only to later discover that robbing banks is not really such a good idea. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That pretty much takes us through the major philosophical areas that are important to at least have some introduction to, some general understanding. Every science has its metaphysics. We all have to use logic. Somewhere in there, ethics is couched, and we can't really pursue ethics very, very deeply without understanding these other branches of philosophy.